The title that I have, which is How to Develop an Academic Career in Non-Malignant Haematology, bears no relationship to the content. Because Mike said, how did you get to be where you were? So I thought about it, and I've worked out how I got to be where I am. And it's fairly wacky, really. And so I'm talking about that. And luckily, I've had a conversation with Professor Toe, and he's going to do the more conventional route that you might take in this modern world. Yes, that one. So I'm a bit worried about the IT. So the first thing to say is I never really wanted to be a haematologist. And I suspect that most of you didn't come out of the cradle and want to be a haematologist. So I was the first ever in my family to go to university. So can I have it on the screen? And I had to do something that had a product at the end. I wasn't allowed to do English or anything like that. But secretly, I really didn't want to do it. And I wanted to be a journalist on the New Musical Express, which at the time met all the bands and worked in the music world. And if I couldn't do that, I wanted to be in a band. And if I couldn't do that, I wanted to be an actress. Is that it? Here we go. Yeah.
Sorry.
So when I went to medical school, I just about did enough to keep going. I was in a band. It was the time of punk. This is the Aerosols. Me and my boyfriend, we formed a band. I met everybody in the punk world. Used to spend many evenings in Eric's. And then I did an awful lot of acting. And so eventually I graduated. And then I decided I wanted to do general medicine. Lovely general medicine. And the problem with general medicine was that it got compartmentalized, so gastroenterology became a speciality, and everything got hived off. So you really couldn't become a general physician anymore. So I worked my way through a lot of junior doctor jobs. And I think the key is that I always was interested in research. So every job I produced a paper, and I think my first paper in neurology was looking at the meaning of a sixth nerve palsy. Anyway, I did actually qualify earlier than everyone else, and I spent most of the time after I qualified in April, everyone else qualified in August, doing locums to make some money because I had no money at all, on the Tropics Haematology ward in Liverpool. I guess that's really where my interest in haematology started. So that's all of us as housemen. The Royal Liverpool Hospital, we were the first house officers there. They've just knocked it down, built a new one. So eventually I did end up in haematology, but my training wasn't like yours. So I ended up at the Hammersmith. You know, the Hammersmith is next door to Wandsworth Prison, and quite honestly, it's difficult to tell the difference between the two, because we used to have to do continuous on-call. So you'd start Friday 9 o'clock and you'd finish Monday night, and over that weekend you would have to do on-call in the lab as the technician, and you're cross-matching blood, and you'd cross-match blood. It'd take about 3/4 of an hour. You'd have to look for malarial parasites. So you're up all night doing that. During the day, you looked after the patients, and you had to irradiate their platelets locally, which took about 2 hours. So a real workhorse. But the good thing about that was I was really nifty in the lab after all that time. And I don't know where I got the energy from. I think I was really put off because at the time in the Hammersmith, we were doing the first allogeneic bone marrow transplants on children, and they all died. There were 5 of them, one by one, which really, that was the end of malignant haematology. For me, I saw some horrible deaths. So I was escaping. So I used to, in the evenings, go and work in Dorothy Crawford's lab. She is a world expert on EBV virus. I grew endothelial cells. I used to collect HUVECs. from the obstetric ward, and I used to immortalise B cells with EBV. And she said to me, why don't you come and do a PhD with me? And I thought about it, I thought, no, that's actually not what my heart is in. And then whilst I was there, I met Peter Goodfellow, who was a molecular biologist, and he offered me a PhD to look at the Y chromosome. At the time, we didn't really know what characteristics made the Y chromosome the Y chromosome. And again, I didn't really want to do it. My heart wasn't in it. Intellectually, it would have been great, but I sort of said no. And I think you have to have your heart in what you do. So the prof at that time was Professor Luzzatto, and I was always going to see him and chat to him about what I could do. I had some pretty harebrained schemes in my head, but he didn't seem to mind. He used to laugh at me, and we had a good chat. And also, whilst I was there, I found time to do a short TV series as a presenter on decision analysis, because us as doctors make more decisions per unit time than any other profession. So they wanted a doctor to talk to, and they'd heard about me through the BBC. I'd already done an audition for BBC earlier. So I think the lessons I learned from all that time was just to keep going, and also people don't mind if you want to go and talk to them. They love it. So I mean, people come and see me and say, what do you think if I do this or do that? Would you be interested in working with me? And it's worth talking to them. So going back to that time, thrombosis and hemostasis, well, it didn't really exist properly. So here's the textbook from the late 70s, the big textbook on blood and its disorders. And it's got 1,500 pages. There were 200 on white cells, and quite a lot on hereditary bleeding disorders, some on acquired bleeding disorders. But when you actually read them, how much space do you think there was dedicated to surgical and traumatic bleeding? Nothing. How many pages covered thrombosis? 1. How many references to DVT and its treatment? None. So there just wasn't a field in thrombosis. So whilst I was doing all my medicine, I was also doing a bit of TV presenting. So I made this series called Professional Judgment, and we looked at different ways of making decisions. And then when I was on maternity leave the first time, I did a science showcase for BBC Two. And I realised I hated it. So I stopped doing it. But actually, it's all been useful, because I have no problems going in front of a television camera, and I can do sound bites, which is what I needed later on after setting up a charity and doing a fair amount of politics. So, went as a senior registrar on the North London rotation, and at that time I was really interested in blood transfusion. And so when I was with Dame Marcela Contreras, I'd already published quite a lot, and she said, I'll give you a research project. So she said, there's a real problem out at Harefield Hospital, which at the time was the biggest heart and heart-lung transplant centre in the world. They're hemolyzing after heart and heart-lung transplantation. Will you go and have a look? Well, they all had positive Coombs, and when you looked at them, they were putting O organs into A and B recipients. They're all going on cyclosporin, and so they had persistence of donor lymphocytes continuing to produce anti-A and anti-B, so that the donor lymphocytes were causing hemolysis of the recipient cells. So that worked out very, very well. And I did all the lab work myself, because I'd already learnt all those skills from the on-call and my work with Dorothy Crawford. So she was very pleased with me. So she said, oh, you can go on a sabbatical now for a month. She paid for me to go to the Red Cross Blood Transfusion Centre in Amsterdam. And my supervisor there was a certain Willem Ouwehand, who now works in Cambridge. And the reason he works in Cambridge is we got on very well. he came over to London to see me, and I introduced him to Sally Davis, who, as you know, is our Chief Medical Officer in England, and at the time was at the Central Middlesex. And they got married, and so he came over. And that explains why he's here and why Sally's married. Anyway, after all that, when I came back, Professor Magdi Yakub phoned me up and said, I want you to come to Harefield. I would like you to become a cardiac lecturer. And basically he said, I'll set you up and you can look at the hematological aspects of heart and heart-lung transplantation. So I loved that idea. I don't know why I didn't want to work with Dorothy Crawford or with Peter Goodfellow. That's just my personality and me. So I had 8 wacky years, first as a lecturer in cardiothoracic surgery and then a senior lecturer in cardiothoracic surgery. You can see Magdi in the middle. So he's now Professor Sir Magdi Yakub. He is still working, he's 82. And quite often on a Saturday, I'll get a phone call from Egypt and he's phoning up to say, I've seen somebody who's got antiphospholipid syndrome, what should I do? He's actually building a cardiac hospital just outside Cairo. And because of his personal magnetism, he brings in an awful lot of money. So that was the unit at the end of the time when I was there. And so he just started paying me a salary. The first day I arrived at Harefield, a crane arrived as well, and it put down a portakabin, and that was my lab. And I had to set up all the assays myself. So I produced pooled normal plasma. I set up all the assays, established normal ranges. I prepared platelets. I really was a bit of a dab hand in the lab in those days. And then there was so much work to do. I took on a couple of technicians. I didn't have to apply for a grant. Magdi said, I'll find the money. And so you can see here Helen and Rachel, who were technicians, both very bright, and they became my PhD students. So it makes it all sound absolutely lovely, but actually it was very hard work because I was the only hematologist in a band of immunologists. And they were very polite, but they had no interest whatsoever in what I was doing. So I was a bit of a lone wolf, for want of a better term. So I thought, well, I'd better just immerse myself in what they're doing. So we used to have academic meetings 2 or 3 times a week. I learnt about T-cell mediated rejection. They were particularly interested in accessory molecules. And then we moved on to the endothelium, and I particularly became interested in the hemostatic aspects of endothelial cell activation. And we did a little bit of basic science there, and I just wrote about it generally for the medical literature at a time when its concept was coming through. Clinically, I kept my hand in by doing a lymphoma clinic at the local hospital, and then myself and a lipidologist set up a clinic for the secondary prevention of atherosclerosis and heart transplant recipients. And that's what I wrote my MD on. So if you have a heart transplant, you can have chronic rejection. And that, in that setting, you get endothelial hyperplasia, much as you would get in the spiral arteries in people with preeclampsia. It was pretty tough. I was living in Sevenoaks, working in Harefield, 2 hours each way. I was doing long working days, and Magdi was the king, and if I wanted to discuss anything with him, I usually had to wait until he'd finished operating on a Friday night. He always did a child, so he originated some of the really basic operations for children with congenital heart disease, and you usually do what they call a switch on Friday night, and the mortality was 50%. So if the baby died, you'd go home because he would be so upset. He didn't want to talk to anybody. And then he used to call me into theatre when there was a bleeder. Oh my goodness, how many bleeders there were. So if you do a heart and lung transplant, you're basically ripping out the heart and lung, and you're leaving a posterior mediastinum that's totally raw. And so you had blood welling up. And they'd say, what should we do? What should we do? They didn't buzz it or anything like that. It was just too big an area. So we trialed a protein, which was the antifibrinolytic available at the time. I spent some time making autologous fibrin glue. I'd take 100 mils of blood from someone before theatre and take out the fibrinogen molecule, and then we were using human thrombin, and we'd combine them together in a gun and spray it on. That helped some time. All these things you can't do now because you'd need a license to be able to do that. I suppose, and the other thing was that everything was a little bit uncontrolled. So Magdi used to look very pale, and one of the days I challenged him and I said, you look really pale, I'm going to check your full blood count. And he'd bled himself down to a hemoglobin of 50 because they used to use whole blood at the end of bypass in the children's procedures, so I put him on iron. Anyway, I had a PhD student looking at a protein in a liver transplantation with my husband to be at King's, and we got introduced to thromboelastometry, which started in liver transplantation. And Rachel looked at activation of coagulation and fibrinolysis in cardiopulmonary bypass. And then the last area of our work was we had £1 million from the Department of Trade and Industry as a hospital to produce an artificial heart. So we were doing experiments, usually in sheep, and the problem at that time was that the material technology hasn't reached the state it had today, so the hearts would usually break down after a couple of days mechanically. I was in charge of looking at biocompatibility, and we established a circuit, and you'd coat the circuit with a material, and the local material scientists at Brunel would change the surface by altering the polymers, and we'd look to see which was the most biocompatible. But really, I got struck with fibrinolysis. I thought it was fab. Nobody else was interested in it. I really was doing quite a lot of work in that area. We were trialling a protein. Protein was used in 1986 at the Hammersmith Hospital, originally to try and reduce shock lung, and actually they found that all the operating fields were dry. And they basically showed that it was an antiplasmin agent, but it had lots of other effects, which I also worked on. And we looked at fibrinolysis in perioperatively using the techniques from the time, and in liver transplantation. Kept publishing. We had new drugs to try in fibrinolysis and using antifibrinolytics. But no one was listening. And I'd go to lots of conferences, lots of transplantation conferences, and they were all very polite, but I was the only hematologist surrounded by immunologists. Mainstream hematology had no interest in my work. Fibrinolysis, chronic rejection and solid organ transplantation, no, not really. So I just seemed to keep going because I thought, this is so interesting, I'm just going to do it. When xenotransplantation came through, which is using pig organs for humans, I at last got some major interest. I got quite a big grant from the British Heart Foundation. Because what is essentially happening is if you perfuse human blood through a pig organ, you get instantaneous thrombosis. It goes black on you. And we had a setup where we had a rig, and you'd get a fresh pig heart, put it on the rig, you perfuse it with pig blood, and you keep it going, and then you put human blood in, it would stop. So we started looking at that, and we realized we could find some major incompatibilities between the pig and the human. So porcine factor 5 will actually activate human platelets. So there's all that type of incompatibility. And the glycoproteins and the carbohydrate moieties that line the endothelium, they were also antigenic for human blood. So the goal was to genetically engineer the pigs so they had different xenoantigens on them, and they had different human anticoagulate molecules on their surface. Unfortunately, it all stopped because we realized that probably you transmit viruses from the pigs to human, and there were no more grants. But it was a fascinating area to go into. So then I finally arrived at Guy's and St Thomas's in the Haemophilia Centre with Jeff Savage, and he said to me, well, we haven't got any thrombosis, it's the real growth area. Would you start doing some clinical work? So I set up some clinics, and we also had a big lupus unit. Graham Hughes, who described antiphospholipid syndrome, worked there, and I did sessions with them. I did the vasculitis and antiphospholipid clinic there. I did the vasculitis because I knew how to use mycophenolate and all the other drugs from working with chronic rejection. So that's sort of how it started, and it's just grown and grown and grown, and we now have 3 dedicated consultants, and we've got Anders Cohen's, that's 4 of us, and an obstetric haematologist, and we've got pharmacists and a big registry of patients with complex disease, and we've got daily clinics except for Friday, and we run all the VTE in the hospital. We've got a submassive VTE protocol, and we've got loads of different clinics, antiphospholipid, teenage, cancer-associated, TTP. But I'm not here to talk about that, because back to the academia, I had told you that I'd done all that work on fibrinolysis, and it had fallen on deaf ears, or so I thought. And one day I had a phone call from Ian Roberts and Shalima Hekira, and they walked like a couple of gunslingers into my office and said, we've come to talk to you about antifibrinolytics, Beverley. Oh. And so from that association, we designed CRASH 2. They'd already done CRASH 1. So Ian is into pragmatic clinical trials. You ask a single question, something versus placebo, in a huge cohort of patients. And all of the noise you've got from the different ways they're managed gets lost because you've got so many numbers. So CRASH 1 had shown that steroids didn't help in head injury. CRASH 2 randomized 20,000 people worldwide to tranexamic acid versus placebo in trauma patients who were bleeding. And we showed that there was a reduction in death. And since that time, we have been campaigning to get it out there globally, because if everybody who came to the emergency department and was bleeding got tranexamic acid, you've got the potential to save 128,000 lives a year. So that's absolutely huge. Trauma in the developing world is the #1 cause of death in men under the age of 40. I think it's about 2 and 3 in the developed world. So really important question. And we're still banging on about it and lecturing about it everywhere. And one of the issues at the time was they said, oh, we'll give it a massive hemorrhage. But in actual fact, if you look at the forest plot, the tranexamic acid has the same effect. It will reduce the same number of deaths proportionately in those who, when they arrive, don't necessarily have massive bleeding. And when we looked at the numbers in CRASH 2, it's just a minority who had massive blood loss. Most didn't. But the mortality rates, obviously, are higher in massive blood loss. So when we looked at the absolute number of deaths that we'd saved more deaths, more people from death in those who didn't have massive bleeding when they arrived than those who'd had massive bleeding, because those who didn't have massive blood loss made up the bulk of the population. So then when I came to lead on the massive blood loss guidelines for the BSH, we changed it to major blood loss so we could encapsulate all those patients and they would get tranexamic acid. Anyway, so we got research paper of the year for that. and started looking at fibrinolysis, because we'd done the trial showing antifibrinolytics had worked, but no one had actually done the basic science to show there was increased activation of fibrinolysis. So did that with Karen Brohe at the Royal London. And then the military came along and said, let's look at the military side, because all of the data, even up to now, is only civilian trauma. So they very kindly gave, I think it was about £100,000. We set up a cold chain to bring samples from Afghanistan back to St Thomas's, and we looked at very much the same things the Royal London had looked at. And we've still not published it to this day, not because we haven't done the work, but because trying to get the clinical data out of the army has proved very difficult. And then, of course, we've got the woman study, which is using tranexamic acid versus placebo in women with postpartum hemorrhage, probably the #1 cause of death in women under the age of 40 in the developing world. And Ian will talk about that tomorrow. So where am I at? Well, I've had Anne Goodyear in my lab for about 6 months, and we've been looking at what happens with free plasmin within an in vitro system. And I've just put this slide in because this is a slide from 5 years ago. And at the time, we were so enthusiastic about tranexamic acid. We said, I think, maybe we should be using it in all surgical operations. And actually, that's what's happened, because NICE have just come out with some guidance. There have been about 180 RCTs and surgical bleeding showing tranexamic acid reduces bleeding. And NICE have come out in their quality standards and said that anyone who's at risk of major bleeding in surgery should have tranexamic acid. It's exciting times. So whilst I was doing all that, I was working on antiphospholipid syndrome. Just got my 5th PhD student, and we're setting up a trial looking at the use of hydroxychloroquine to improve obstetric outcome. So we've done mainly observation and clinical trials, a little bit of translational work. I did patent a new way of looking for antiphospholipid antibodies, but like all of my patents, it's come to nothing. And actually, if you get a patent, it's only 1 in 10,000 that will ever come to anything. But it's quite fun trying to get it. And then at the same time, starting to set up a charity, and I'm going to talk about that this afternoon. And lastly, trying to do more and more in obstetric haematology, which was really a very neglected area. Working with Sue Pavard, we set up the BSH Obstetric Haematology Group, and we have produced a manual, just finished off the 3rd edition. So I've had a pretty wacky time, and I suppose it's all about attitude, and as Winston Churchill said, attitude is a little thing that makes a big difference. And the other thing is that I always work bloody hard. I'm sure everybody says that. And Mrs. Thatcher said, I do not know anyone who's got to the top without hard work. That is the recipe. It will not always get you to the top, but it should get you pretty near. So, yeah. So my advice to you, read. Every week I go through the New England Journal, the Lancet, the British Journal of Haematology, have a look at blood, scan them all and just read some of the articles. Get publishing, just write up case reports, get started, perhaps do a little tiny research project if you're with somebody for a reasonable length of time. Audits are pretty good too. The problem for all of us is that the medical degree doesn't teach you to be a scientist. So you need to learn how to be critical. So one of the ways of doing that is obviously to do a research degree. If you can't really, or you don't want to do that, you could talk to your consultant colleague and say, are you reviewing articles, and help them with that. I probably do review an article a week for some journal somewhere, anything from the New England Journal down to the Lupus Journal. every time I review it, I get my critical hat on, I think about how they've done it. Quite often I'm going to have to look up something in a textbook, so I'm constantly up to date and renewing my knowledge. And absolutely vital is to do a statistics course because it's got so complex. The rules are fairly simple, and perhaps learn how to use one of the computer programs. And then use time effectively. There is never enough time. So you can pack in a lot into a working day if you don't sit around drinking coffee all day. Having said that, you need to talk to everybody because you'd be surprised how useful something you've learned one day might be next year. Find yourself a mentor. I've been so blessed with wonderful mentors when I was a medical student. I had Magdi. People in haematology have been very kind. Just talk to people as you go. And the other thing is you can't predict the future. So what might seem of little value now, such as, I did a television presenter series 20 years ago, which no one has ever seen, has actually been very useful now if I want to do any work for the charity. And then the last thing is, if you work hard and play hard, the two bounce off each other. So I do triathlon. There's Alistair Brownlee there, who has won 2 gold medals at the Olympics now as triathlon champion. And we're both in the same British team. It's wonderful to get a picture with him. My poor kids, they've been dragged around the world. One of the first words my son said was antiphospholipid syndrome. It's difficult. He knows more than anyone else. And also lots of thanks to all the people who've put up with me over the years doing PhDs and MDs. We all went out for dinner a while back. And then top right, probably my favourite mentor, Dr. Robertson, mad as a hatter. Absolutely lovely, always supporting me. When things were bad, I did take 5 goes at doing MRCP. I thought I was going to give up. He kept me going, pushing me on. And then at the bottom, we've got the lupus team at St Thomas's, Graham Hughes again. Very wacky view on life, but always terribly enthusiastic and always keen and pushing you on. So I'm very sorry you've had to listen to all of this. I feel like I've bared my soul to you, and I think you'll get more sense out of Professor Toe. Thank you.